The Silence. This is Lesson 4 from a book called Clairaudience, The Philosophy of Its Expression by JC Fremont, published in 1911. The Silence. A great deal has been written and said about the silence, and most students of the new psychology and occult science have an intelligent, if not a clearly defined conception of what the silence means. And yet it has been often defined in terms so misleading and ambiguous that we know what it is most by what it is not. It is within the mind, and yet it is neither a form nor a product of thought. It is not the subjective in contradistinction to the objective mind. It is not a mental pose or attitude, although relaxation or passivity of the mind is necessary to realize it. It is not thoughtlessness, nor thoughtfulness, although the silence is that state of mind which neither the absence nor the presence of thought can define. Mental unconsciousness, called the trance, is not the silence, and yet it often sweeps one into it and gives ecstatic and supernormal experiences. Absent-mindedness or distraction, as in oblivion and reverie, is not technically the silence, for they imply conditions imposed on consciousness rather than that sublime, rarefied state designated the silence. Mental scientists have treated the silence as though it were the subjective reservoir from which one draws positive response to all objective suggestions, while metaphysicians, the spiritual or divine scientist, treat it as the oracle of prayer or aspiration, the holy of holies, which mediates the ego between the outer, objective mind and inner court, subjective mind, of intelligence and God. Excellent and splendid as are these suggestions on the subject of the silence, that of the divine scientist approaches nearest to our own definition of it. Mental action and inaction, thoughtlessness and thoughtfulness, interior and exterior methods of inducing stillness are supplementary and auxiliary to the state itself which the silence defines. It is a spiritual before it is a mental state of passivity or physical condition of rest. And the word spiritual implies and explains more than and all that the other words vaguely convey. A spiritual state is a permanent quality or capacity of consciousness, which no sense perception or experience can define or make clear. It is the spirit's own possession, which the pure character or life alone will reveal and make a source of power, plenty, and peace. It is the well of living water within each one, so truly and symbolically described by John in the 4th chapter of his Gospel, of which every outward, full, or stagnant well of water, the mind, is but a gross caricature or coarse dissimilitude. For the life that is running away from us in the adulteries of thought and action, as in all that leads the soul to lose itself in the world of pleasure, makes a farce of the silence, and until the awakening comes, as in the prodigal son, the soul will not know rest or peace until it finds them within and above whence they come. To be still is the one crying need or condition of the physical man or woman, but it is not enough or all. For to realize that which is within the mind, after the storm of worry has abated and the sky of mind has cleared, and the cost or loss is known, one must be willing and ready to live the spiritual life which qualifies one to understand and realize the silence. This is why many brands and substitutes which are offered as just as good and which are accepted as genuine prove valueless. Narrow is the way which leads to life, and few indeed love it sufficiently to seek life on the only way where it can be found, but prefer the broad way of humbugs and brands which counterfeit the spiritual. Yet the silence alone is found on the narrow way, And strange to say, it is begun in this life, just where one is in thought and action. The scriptural broad way is not a way at all, in the strict use of the word, but the experience of the senses, while the narrow way is the realization of one's divinity. A textbook of the new psychology which deals with the language, powers, and life of the spirit must borrow from divine or mystical science adequate and comprehensive definitions of these words. For divine or mystic science is supersensuous and spiritual, rather than sensuous and intellectual in its revealments, and it treats of spirit, the spiritual life and the spiritual world as such, and from the consciousness and realization of them, and not theoretically or dogmatically, nor from the intellectual viewpoint. Hence, the silence can never be obtained by any intellectual or moral process, or by intellectual or moral culture, refined as it may be, but is and must be a spiritual attainment. This does not mean that physical, intellectual, and moral rules for obtaining external stillness, harmony of mind, and beauty of surroundings should be ignored. But it means that the stillness, harmony, aesthetical alone, can never take the place of or be substituted for the state of the spirit, in which the silence lies potentially as the treasure hidden in the field. Many intellectually trained minds may scoff at this statement, as the Pharisees of old who ridiculed many of the mysteries of the Spirit which Jesus Christ taught. But to those who aspire for reality and are not satisfied with reflections, who prefer sunlight to moonlight, the word initiation will mean as much as regeneration, and they will open and close two doors as they pray and purify themselves. One, the physical and the sensuous, the other, the mental and the ethical, and take the third degree of perfection by entering the shrine or holy of holies of the Spirit. Lest some may think such language too ambiguous to be practical, they need only to be reminded that the purest and best in this life, and the life which is to come, is not an intellectual, mental, nor a material, but a spiritual possession, and as such is a supreme necessity. Useful as a material body is to the spirit, it is discarded when death calls the spirit to another life and world. All that body attracted or described by its environment and earthly possessions remain on earth or perishes with it. The mind, which is the finer objective body or tool of the spirit, no less serviceable and valuable, disintegrates as a vapor, and though capable of being reproduced in vitoscopic memory by the spirit, is as perishable as the body. The intelligent ego that used the body and the mind slips behind the scenes when the curtain falls, to become better acquainted with itself after the masquerade of form, paint, tinsel, and action have been removed. What has the spirit thus denuded of a physical body done to qualify itself for the higher condition, the inner state of its post-mortem existence? Did it lock the doors of the senses to express and realize the supernormal powers, so that in consciousness here and now it could feel, hear, see, think, and act divinely, and not as one in slavish captivity or obsessed by the senses? Did it shut out terrestrial sights to see visions celestial? Did it shut out earthly sounds and voices to hear heavenly music and the voices of the silence? Not that it should hate, spurn, and abhor all outward things, but rather augment the human with the divine, that it should not allow the sensuous to have dominion over it, drawing it away from the sphere of freedom, truth, love, peace, and bliss. For no one can either enter or abide in the silence whose senses are actively engaged, and are not closed to worldly pleasures. Nor can anyone hope to function sanely on the supernormal plane who, at any time, allows the allurements of outward senses to absorb him. This is all important. If the silence were received by entering some outward tabernacle and there becoming worshipful, instead of betaking one's self to an inner shrine, and there proving one's worthiness, if it were more a condition of the mind, and less a state of life and consciousness, it would be easily obtainable. But ingress to the spiritual world of realities is no less a path inward toward God, as is an abnegation of the very influences and things which obstruct that blessed and luminous path, and compels a sacrifice of self, and a working humanitarian love of mankind. So that while there is both a superphysical and psychological side of the silence, which to some is its most important side, because technically and most easily comprehended, the spiritual, ethical, and practical side, which to the mass of students is neglected or slighted, is the key to the revealments of the silence itself. Theory, however excellent and practical, is not here misprized, but it is applied with absolute fidelity to deduce results. For the silence is not a reception room where outward conversation ceases and no inward communion takes place, but it is the meeting place of the soul with all oversouls, of spirit with spirit, the lover with the beloved in the deep divine sense. And here the broken-hearted, the comfortless, the bereaved, all who yearn for the touch of a vanished hand and the sound of a voice that is still, can receive direct evidences from their spirit loved ones who draw nearer them in the silence, in love and devotion. Mysticism is the science of the silence. It means exactly what the silence defines. For the mystic is one who knows how to seal lips, eyes, and ears, that he may consciously enjoy the arcana of the spirit and the spiritual world, the communion of spirits. And thus a spirit can and does commune with spirit, as his own inner experiences prove. To the Eastern or Western occultist, the silence is the inner oasis where the weary pilgrim stops for a time to drink deeply of its crystal waters before pushing on to paradise. As such, it lies, as it were, midway between the subjective and spiritual sphere of the soul, and that sphere is the human consciousness. The soul is as active when in the silence as it is passive before it enters it. But such activity is supermental as well as supersensuous, and therefore it can best be defined by the compound subjective or spiritual communion. To subjectify oneself is not necessary to withdraw from the sense world, although one does consciously withdraw from the objective physical life. But to spiritualize the subjective mind is to allow the consciousness, free of mental or sensuous activity, to declare itself and so unite, blend, or fuse with spiritual realities. This is how the silence becomes a means of percipiency and recipiency, so far as telepathic and clairaudient communications are concerned. The percipient sends or posts his messages as the recipient receives them in the silence, and to the extent that both the percipient and recipient consciously realize telepathically the office and value of the silence and so enter it, they are able to successfully transmit and receive clairaudient and telepathic messages. Fundamental conditions must be complied with before results can be expected, and the wise student is one who will not neglect necessary although not always accepted, rules for the attainment of the silence.